people who like to explore abandoned buildings. What was the biggest "this, I'm out" moment you had while exploring? A group of us went into an old abandoned care home. We got in legally. It was pitch black, and I mean the type of darkness where you cannot see your hand in front of your face even when you let your eyes adjust. Fortunately, we had a few light sources with us. After walking around and finding copious amounts of evidence that there were squatters staying there, not at the time of our arrival, thank God, we found ourselves standing in a room filled with graffiti, but not graffiti from a paint can. This was spelled in dried blood and excrement. The stench was horrendous. We got out of there so quick and have never been back since. Broke into an abandoned house in the village I grew up in England back when I was a teenager, maybe 15 years ago now. Was with a couple friends but broke off by myself and ventured upstairs. When I turned at the top of the stairs, I saw a figure standing in the darkness just staring at me. I bolted out of the building as quickly as I could and my friends heard me and panicked. They weren't far behind. Went back there a couple of weeks later with a bigger group to prove my story, and to my embarrassment, it was a tall mirror at the top of the stairs. The figure I saw was me. Not my proudest moment. A couple years ago I lived in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi, most foreigners like me lived in something called compounds. In these compounds there were houses and there were swimming pools and football courts and all that kind of stuff, and inside, you can do what you like. There was this one old apartment block that had been abandoned for years, and all of the guards said not to go into it. One day, me and my friend snuck in and went inside. It was really creepy. There was a staircase that went straight into a wall and the pictures were all weird and we were all super creeped out. We then went into an attic and then we heard two men talking. We got freaked the fuck out and ran. The next day we wanted to see it again and we were less shocked since we'd already seen it. We went back into that attic and it turned out, it was just two Bengali maintenance workers chilling. I was exploring with my parents an abandoned Soviet small city where the soldiers and their families stayed. It was getting dark because of the coming storm. I found a basement and thought to just take a fast look into it. It was really dark, but I heard my mom saying on the other side of the basement corridor that she found something and I should see it. I just asked where she was, then I heard my mom again from behind telling me to hurry up because the storm is coming and it started to rain. I was 20 at the time, but I turned around and got the fuck out of there with tears rolling down my cheeks and shaking like there's no tomorrow. I told my mom AMD, she said it's another reason to just leave ASAP. I used to walk around an abandoned building near a forest which was initially a child hospital in the 70s, a refugee housing in the 90s and a language school for Chinese students till 2007. Since then it's abandoned. The students left quite suddenly, so I found diaries, certificates and even food. It was interesting since the place was not vandalized at that time. Once I was inside the building again when I realized someone else was walking upstairs. I never left this place so fast, jumped over the gate and headed to my car. When I reached there, a police car stopped in front of the building and the two officers jumped over the fence to enter the building. No idea what was there, but sometimes I wonder if I avoided more than just a report for trespassing. Late to the party but used to work for a guy renovating houses. He'd buy dumps for like 5 to 10,000 that had been abandoned for years. We'd fix them up and he'd rent the houses out. His daughter would go to houses to take pictures after he bought them since he'd buy a lot of them sight unseen because they were so cheap. One house she went to take pictures at and she was kinda creeped out by the basement and did not want to go in. She just opened the door, leaned in, reached her arm out and took a picture. When her dad reviewed the pictures he saw a man standing in the basement about 5 feet from the camera staring directly into it. Danvers State Mental Hospital. Stumbling across an overgrown graveyard full of tiny little headstones with nothing but patient numbers, no names, no dates. The overwhelming inhumanity that all of those nameless graves represented hit me at once. I'm not easily frightened, and exploring an abandoned mental institution in the middle of the night had been an exciting adventure until that discovery. Even then, I wasn't afraid. Deeply saddened and nauseated, I lost my curiosity. I felt ashamed to be intruding on a space that had seen levels of human cruelty and suffering far beyond what I could ever imagine, so I left and never went back. Several years ago, a man was murdered in the city I was working in and parts of his body were turning up at various locations. I think his hand and foot had been found and a week had passed. I'm an architectural designer and I was surveying an abandoned chapel that was slated to be renovated into condos. It was apparent that homeless people had been squatting in the chapel, but I wasn't sure how recently they had been there. When I went into the basement though, it was clear someone was either there or had just left based on the smell. There were no lights due to the power being cut and I didn't stick around long enough to see if anyone was currently occupying the space. 2 days later someone reported that they found the torso and head of the murdered man in a building attached to the chapel. I had been too freaked out by the smell in the basement to continue on to the attached building. But I'm almost certain I would have been the one to find the body. There was a coffin, a real coffin. We were in an abandoned factory that some rich family had owned, and there was this one room with a bunch of personal stuff, letters from the 50s, furniture, old photographs, clothes, even booze, like someone's home had been put in there. In the middle of it all a coffin. I swear. The room was gloomy, it was a late summer afternoon, no power and we didn't have flashlights. My friend was like, we gotta open this coffin, we can't leave unless we do. We got her and straight up lifted the lid. A sweet smell came from the darkness. When my grandmother died I was the one to find the corpse and I remember that one quite well. So my heart skipped a couple of beats. The coffin was full of candles. They had a sweet smell. Exploring an abandoned manor with some friends. We had been drinking and smoking and thought it would be cool. The ground floor entrances were covered with bricks so we had to enter through the first floor, 8 ft height, using an improvised ladder made of old trash and wood pieces. It was quite unstable and hard to climb and we were 5 or 6 people. Being the only way out, and knowing how slow it was, I was on edge the whole time. We were exploring the floor, cool glass ceiling, lots of debris, but suddenly we find a room filled with plastic containers with pink and brown liquids. Some friends decide to explore the ground floor, which was pitch black and involved going down a broken staircase missing several steps. They heard someone coughing in the dark and feel several people moving in the darkness as their eyes get used to it. At this point I was hearing someone slowly walking in a room on the first floor, carefully stepping over the broken glass on the floor, to not make noise, which was really creepy. We got away and on our way out we saw a roughed up man with bloodshot eyes leaving a shack outside the house and staring at us. I still shiver when I remember his look. Probably just some junkies living there, but for overly high 15-year-olds it was scary as was an extra on a film shoot at Condemned Hospital in Norway. It used to be part of the Cold War era safety infrastructure so it was connected to mountain bunkers via underground passages. The director, myself and a few others decided to explore these for a lark during a break. There was no power in the underground area so we had to bring flashlights, and while the first 50 meters or so were fairly benign looking despite having long disused morgue rooms lining them, we started encountering scratched walls and random piled objects a couple hundred meters in. We turned around when we heard footsteps and something that sounded like a stack of metal chairs being knocked over, and walked back to back so we were sure we had lights on every dark corner until we got back to the shooting area. I'd sprained my ankle the day before so I was very grateful the other didn't panic and leg it without me. Was exploring an abandoned asylum in Scotland and it wasn't so bad because all the roofs and floors had collapsed and it was all pretty open and you could literally run in any direction to get out, except on the way out I saw this little square opening in the foundations that was a little bit narrower than my shoulders but about 1.5 feet long. So I stuck my head in with a head torch on and started looking around inside. Not much to see but a roughly 10 feet corridor with a turn at the end and a couple of inches of water. I said something to one of my buddies standing at my feet and noticed that there was a pretty cool echo when I spoke so I started making all the usual random sounds you make when playing within a HOI environment until I heard a very distinctive slosh of water exactly like someone going from standing stock still in the shallow water to taking a step in my direction from just round the corner of the corridor. I've never launched myself backwards from the prone position faster in my life. My son, 13-year, and I were exploring an old diner north of Grand Rapids, Michigan late one afternoon. It had an adjoining putt-putt golf area and an ice cream shack. We cautiously moved through the broken glass and looked around inside. It was so cool. So many things that could be repurposed. We walked around the bar stool area and into the kitchen. It was really clean compared to everything else. It started to get creepy. I noticed the meth lab equipment and started to realize we walked into an active lab. So lucky we got out of there. Exploring an old trailer that had been left abandoned for years, I found a little stone statue of Jesus at the base of a large, dead tree. I squat down and touched it, causing it to instantly crumble from the pressure. Felt like I'd activated some ancient curse. Exploring an old junkyard. Lots of rusting school buses and other vehicles. Then a horse skeleton, still leashed to a tree. Nope. Never went back. I was walking up the porch, and noticed that what I thought were wind chimes were actually multiple knives tied to string hanging from the ceiling, a few of them caked with blood. Cane Hill Psychiatric Asylum in the UK, which could hold over 3,000 patients. Victorian era. The whole place was spooky AF. A total labyrinth. We found the morgue. 2 ceramic tables in the general shape of bodies. One was thick with dust, grime and mold. The other was absolutely sparkling clean, spotless. The 3 of us left immediately. I walked into an old abandoned cabin in my neighborhood. I saw movement around me, and when I shined my flashlight to the walls there were thousands of cockroaches and spiders on the walls. I noped right out of there. My brother-in-law was exploring an abandoned house that had been razed so only the basement remained, open to the air. There was a mantle over the still remaining fireplace, although the chimney was gone. On the mantle were a series of Polaroid photos, the Instamatic kind. When he walked over to look at the photos he discovered they were all photos of the backs of people looking at photos on the mantle. He does like to tell stories, but that one really got to me. I do urban exploring quite frequently, and nothing ever makes us leave instantly apart from dodgy floors or squatters. However, 5 years ago me and a few friends explored a derelict farmhouse without buildings which had evidently been left for decades with the state it was in. After having a look around the place and finding nothing but empty buildings, we had a look inside what appeared to be an old stable. Inside was literally 100s of empty tins of cat food, some nooses tied to a beam, and a fairly new pair of scissors with a brownish crust covering the blades. The smell was putrid. We ventured further into the building and noticed on the flood was a cat's tail and a few cat's paws which had been dismembered and left on the floor. We swiftly exited, and on our way out a pickup pulled up onto the side of the farm, bearing in mind it was surrounded by woods and fields with no track leading to it, with 3 men stood in the bed. Needless to say, we got out of there as quick as we could and haven't seen or heard anything about it. The farm went on the market and sold earlier this year, so it would be interesting to see who previously owned it. Me and my friends often hung outside of this abandoned factory-type building, pretty huge. At first we just hung out there on the outside, drinking and smoking weed, teen stuff, but one time we decided to open up one of the boarded windows and go inside. We weren't into far when we turned a corner and found a pile of semi-fresh blood, along with a bloody pipe and some needles. When we realized there were also people inside, homeless we assumed, deeper inside the building, we got out of there and never hung out there again. Demolished nowadays. There's an abandoned old cabin in the middle of the woods that's near my house. I believe it's from the early 1900s, and it's falling apart and blocked off by the rangers. But they don't really patrol this forest, so it's easy to jump the gate and hike up to the cabin. I decided to explore one day and climbed up the rotting deck to the main cabin. It was so dark and musty with broken glass and acorns everywhere. I went deeper into the cabin to explore the different rooms. As I was walking around, I started to hear a rustling noise. Me being a dumbass, I started to walk closer to the sound. I moved a rotting board over to the side and a fucking squirrel leapt out and attached itself to my sweater. I start screaming and grabbed the squirrel with my hands and threw it off me. I ran out of that cabin and never looked back. I still pass the cabin when I hike with my dog, but I've learned my lesson. It belongs to the forest now. Oh man, my friends and I were exploring the hospital I was born in that had since been abandoned. We explored down to the underground floor strapped with paintball guns for safety. There was all sorts of weird shit. A room full to the ceiling with toilets, mushrooms growing on the walls, etc. While exploring the underground floor, we found a McDonald's burger still wrapped up. I picked it up. It was warm. There's one house in my neighborhood that creeps the ever-loving out of me. I guess it's been abandoned for some time, because there's a dumpster in the driveway and the grass looks like it hasn't been mowed in years, but no one's attempted to buy it or refurbish it. Every time I go near the place I get the heebie-jeebies, but one night, around 2 or 3-ish in the morning, I saw the chandelier on and swaying slightly in the living room. There were no other lights on in the house, and I didn't see any people or signs of people around. I've never noped past a house so fast in my life. I've been many places in the Tree State area and have experienced floors that are decaying. Once almost fell, thankfully was a very small drop, needles, animal corpses, etc. One time at a prison in NJ I saw a cell that was decked out with a decorated dollhouse and you could tell someone was staying there. The creepiest experience I ever had was about 6 years ago. I was in an abandoned hospital in a residential part of Nick which had been abandoned less than a decade prior to our visit. Despite this, it was not a well-known location. We went at night and were exploring the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors all without issue and in total silence. There was little to no graffiti and everything was left: patient records and tissue samples, medicines, medical equipment. As we reached the 4th floor, we passed a random room that said no explosive gases can be used in this room. I read a sound aloud and we immediately heard a huge thud coming from inside that exact room. My blood ran cold and I literally froze because I felt that someone in that room was making themselves known. We ran out of there and heard slamming doors as we went down all the stairs. I have not been back there since and it's now been sold and is being renovated into a housing complex. I still wonder what would have happened if we went into the room.